Hello and welcome to the programme. The First Minister is to announce more details on Scotland's route out of lockdown. Nicola Sturgeon is expected to give proposed dates for the reopening of shops and hospitality as she sets out more information on the plans for the easing of restrictions over the next few weeks. Well, we'll be crossing live to Holyrood for that update shortly, but first let's catch up with our political correspondent David Wallace-Lockhart. David, quite a highly anticipated statement today because we are expecting to get quite a bit more detail from the First Minister on what's coming in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, Lindsay, it sounds like what we hear today could be the most extensive update we've had in some time. Now, the Scottish Government originally said coming out of lockdown would be driven by data, not dates. So we must assume they like some of the data they're seeing at the moment because they are going to give us dates today. Proposed dates, at least indicative dates, but for some key events for coming out of lockdown. So we'll get a proposed date for when the stay-at-home order will end. That, of course, is still the case, that we're currently only meant to leave our houses for essential reasons. We'll get proposed dates for shops opening back up. We'll get proposed dates for outdoor and indoor hospitality in that order opening back up, and also proposed dates for when some changes around the amount of households we're allowed to meet up and socialising with will change too. Could be dates for other types of businesses too to look out for this afternoon. And it sounds like from what the First Minister was saying earlier this week, that the Scottish Government are confident they can move ahead with some clarity for getting out of lockdown. We're looking, I think, at blocks of events happening sort of early April, late April, mid-May, 3 weeks between each block.
And David, as you mentioned there, we're getting dates today. That was something that was missing, arguably missing from the initial route map out of lockdown and was being called for. What are we hearing ahead of today's statement from opposition parties and from businesses and others?
Well, the Scottish Conservatives, like you say, Lindsay, had been calling for dates, even if they were indicative. They said it was important that the business community had something to work towards at least. So now the question is, are they happy with the dates they'll get presented with this afternoon? We know the Scottish Conservatives have been calling for some elements of coming out of lockdown to speed up, such as gyms. They think gyms should be open sooner than has currently been outlined because they think the benefits to physical health, to mental health outweigh any sort of risk when it comes to that. Scottish Labour also broadly happy to be hearing that we'll get some proposed dates this afternoon, although they have been raising what they have concerns about when it comes to the testing numbers that are currently being achieved towards the tracing numbers that are currently being achieved by the Scottish Government. And those concerns around the capacity of testing that's currently being used are concerns shared by the Scottish Lib Dems as well. And I suspect we'll hear from the Scottish Greens when it comes to elements of the business community opening back up. I think they'll focus on what they'd like to see is regular testing tied to the industries that start to function again. So the opposition parties will get an opportunity to question the First Minister after she's delivered her statement, which we're expecting shortly.
And David, tied to all of this coming out of lockdown this time is the vaccine. That is the big difference. There have been some concerns, though, about the AstraZeneca vaccine, haven't there?
Yeah, this is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, one that's being used widespread across the UK and, of course, here in Scotland too. Now, a number of European countries have suspended its use currently. Concern around blood clotting that they are worried is linked to the vaccination. Nicola Sturgeon took this head on yesterday at the Scottish Government briefing. She said that all the evidence that she'd seen and all the advice she was getting from UK regulators was that the vaccine was perfectly safe to be using at the moment. They didn't have concerns about any links to blood clotting there, and she was encouraging anyone who has a vaccination scheduled or shortly will get a vaccination appointment given to them, they should take up that opportunity. The benefits of getting vaccinated, the Scottish Government say, far outweigh any sort of risk. So really stressing that they hadn't seen any evidence to raise concerns about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. We also heard from the Chief Medical Officer yesterday, Dr. Gregor Smith, who could normally be sort of plays everything with a straight bat, but he got quite sort of animated for him about this issue of the vaccination, saying he was categorically wholly confident in the vaccine. And again, he was urging anyone who has a vaccination scheduled to come and get that jab, allowing us all to hopefully live a much more normal life in the near future.
And David, in terms of vaccinations, there had been a dip in the number of people being vaccinated, but we do expect that number in Scotland to start going up again quite rapidly, don't we?
That's right, Lindsay. So since about mid-February, we've seen the daily vaccination numbers dip quite a bit lower in Scotland into the sort of 20 and 30,000s regularly each day. And that's much lower than what we had previously been doing. There were days in early February when we were getting over 60,000 doses. Now, that's been linked to a dip, like you say, in supply numbers of the Pfizer vaccine. Now, that supply, as of this week, should be picking up again. And Nicola Sturgeon is confident we'll be seeing what she called a significant rise in daily dose numbers. It'll be interesting to see. I'm sure she'll give us the figure before she gets into her statement this afternoon of what we achieved in the past 24 hours. And she was confident we'd get back to hitting that target of delivering 400,000 doses a week. Scottish Government seem quite confident, optimistic about the vaccine doses they're going to be delivering each week coming into April and into mid-April, saying that they're confident that all over 50s, everyone with an underlying health condition and unpaid carers will all have been given one dose of the vaccine by the middle of next month. That's a target they've had in place for a while. Seem quite confident about hitting that target and still confident for the overall bigger target of getting all adults in Scotland vaccinated with one dose of a vaccine by the end of July.
And the vaccination numbers have become part of that daily slew of figures that we get from the government. And David, you mentioned data must be looking good for the Scottish Government to be progressing with the easing of lockdown. Just give us a sense of the trends that we're seeing in the figures at the moment.
So we've got today's figures, Lindsay, which came out just a few minutes ago, and we have had a slight uptick in case numbers in the past week or so, but that was something addressed by the Chief Medical Officer yesterday, who said, broadly speaking, he was quite happy with the numbers we were looking at, pointed out that it was quite a few weeks ago now that the first pupils started going back to school full time, something we know the government always thought could lead to a slight increase in case numbers. Not necessarily the children themselves spreading it, but just parents being out the house more, taking children to school, things like that. So we have today's figures, 597 positive tests, but the test positivity rate, that's the number, the proportion of people who get a test and it comes back positive, that's only 3.8%. Down a bit lower than yesterday, well below that 5% figure where the World Health Organization defines COVID as being under control. So that's a positive figure to be seeing there. Hospital numbers, as of today, 440 people in hospital in Scotland with confirmed coronavirus. That's dropped by 7. And that's a number that we've really seen tumbling down in the past month or so. And of course is such a key number if we're focusing on getting out of lockdown, because avoiding the NHS in Scotland being overwhelmed is principally what we've been focusing on in this lockdown. 42 people in ICU with confirmed coronavirus. I think that's gone up slightly by 2 since yesterday, and sadly we've seen 7 deaths in the past 24 hours of people who've had a positive test for coronavirus in the past 28 days. But when it comes to that daily number, that daily figure of tests we're seeing coming back positive, slight uptick perhaps on the figures we're looking at around a week or so ago, but like I said, the Scottish Government health officials seem quite relaxed about the figures, and I'm sure we wouldn't be getting this extensive update from Nicola Sturgeon shortly if she wasn't quite happy with the data she's currently looking at.
OK, David, thanks for setting the scene for us just now. We'll be back with you later, but we are going to cross over to Holyrood just now, where Topical Questions is just finishing up, and we'll be hearing from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, shortly.
Point of view to the one that Mr Greer has put forward. But the point that Mr Greer puts to Parliament is an issue which I think must be openly debated and discussed. We must have an assessment system that reflects our curriculum and which commands confidence within the country. And there's perfectly legitimate arguments for a continuous assessment model versus an end-of-session examination model, or a mixture of both, which is essentially some of the arrangements we have just now. But I think that issue that Mr Greer raises is an entirely legitimate issue for us to focus on, and there's plenty of evidence out there for us to have that discussion.
Claire Adamson. We may have lost Claire Adamson from the looks of things. I'm afraid so. We're going to have to move on now. That concludes topical questions. We'll move on to the next item of business. And the next item is a statement from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, on COVID-19. The First Minister will, as usual, take questions at the end of her statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question, please press your request to speak button, and I call on the First Minister.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. My statement today will set out our next steps out of lockdown and back towards a way of life that is much closer to normality. I intend to set out in some detail how and in what order we hope to ease restrictions between now and the middle of May, and I will set out, albeit in more general terms, our expectations beyond that. I must stress, of course, because it is simply an inescapable fact, that being able to deliver on the plans I outlined today is dependent on continued progress in suppressing the virus and rolling out vaccines. However, I do hope that this statement will provide welcome reassurance that brighter days are indeed ahead of us. Before turning to the detail, I'll provide some context on the state of the epidemic, and I'll start with a summary of today's figures. 597 positive cases were reported yesterday, which is 3.8% of all tests carried out, and takes the overall number of cases now to 210,605. 440 people are currently in hospital. That's 7 fewer than yesterday, and 42 people are in intensive care. That is 2 more than yesterday. I also regret to report that in the past 24 hours, a further 7 deaths have been registered, and the total number of deaths under that measurement is now 7,517. And once again, my deepest condolences go to all those who have lost a loved one. Indeed, 1 week today, when we mark the first anniversary of lockdown, the whole nation will be invited to share in a minute's silence as we reflect on those we have lost and on the painful sacrifices that have been made by so many over the past year. Presiding Officer, we are currently, as of now, recording across Scotland an average of 570 new COVID cases each day. And there are 2 points about that which it is important to make. The first is positive. Case numbers have fallen sharply since the early part of this year, as a result, of course, of the tough restrictions we're all living under. In January, we were recording more than 1,000 cases a day on average, and even just 3 weeks ago, the average number of cases each day was 815. So we've seen a significant reduction since then, which indicates the progress that has been made in suppressing the virus. The second point is slightly less positive. The 570 cases per day on average over the past week is up slightly from an average of 490 the week before. Now, that's not a massive increase, but it's clearly not the direction of travel we want to see, so we'll be monitoring it carefully and also taking it as a reminder that we have no room for complacency. Care and caution in the face of this virus continues to be essential. What is unambiguously positive so far is the progress of the vaccination programme. We have now vaccinated virtually all over 65-year-olds and also 59% of 60 to 64-year-olds, 41% of 55 to 59-year-olds and 34% of 50 to 54-year-olds. In total, as of 8:30 this morning, 1,943,507 people have received the first dose of the vaccine. That is already more than 40% of the adult population and is an increase of 34,516 since yesterday. We expect around 400,000 vaccinations to be administered over this week, and we hope that level can be maintained through April, subject, as always, to vaccine supplies. However, it's not just the scale of the vaccination programme that is positive. What we are learning about its impact is also hugely encouraging. We can already see that it is having a significant impact on the number of deaths. According to National Records of Scotland, the number of COVID deaths has more than halved in the past 2 weeks. And there are now also positive indications from research, including a study last week from Public Health Scotland, that the vaccines also reduce transmission of the virus, and that is really significant. So this provides us now with greater confidence than we could have had previously about the impact of the vaccine on suppression of the virus. And that in turn gives us more confidence about mapping a path out of lockdown with a firmer indicative timeline for lifting restrictions. We have, of course, announced and implemented some significant changes already. Last week, the restrictions on outdoor gatherings and activities were eased slightly, and as of yesterday, all primary-age children are back in school full-time, and the phased return of secondary schools is also underway. After the Easter break, which for some will be the 12th of April, we hope that all children will be back in school full-time. Now, obviously, we will continue to monitor the impact of these changes. However, I am able to set out now some further changes that we hope to be able to make in early April. I can confirm, firstly, that we expect to lift the current stay-at-home rule on the 2nd of April. Initially, although we hope this will be for no more than 3 weeks, stay-at-home will be replaced by guidance to stay local. In other words, not to travel outside your own local authority area unless for an essential purpose. People will continue to be able to meet up outdoors, including in private gardens, in groups of no more than 4 from 2 households. Our other changes in early April will take effect from Monday the 5th. On that day, we expect contact sports for 12 to 17-year-olds to resume. We also expect that from 5th April, more students, particularly in further education, will be allowed to return to on-campus learning. Colleges will prioritise those students whose return is essential, including those who are most at risk of not completing their courses. And that includes those who are taking qualifications in construction, engineering, hairdressing, beauty and related courses. We also expect to begin the phased reopening of non-essential retail on the 5th of April. Click and collect retail services will be permitted to reopen from that date, along with homeware stores and car showrooms and forecourts. And garden centres will also be able to reopen on the 5th of April, which I know is important as we head towards the summer period. And last, but for some of us definitely not least, we expect hairdressers and barber salons to reopen for appointments on the 5th of April as well. Presiding Officer, these changes will, I hope, make a real difference to people in a number of different ways. However, given the state of the virus and the extent of vaccination, what I have just set out is the maximum we consider possible at that stage to do safely. However, during April, we expect our vaccination programme to reach an important milestone. By the middle of April, supplies permitting, which I have to say is still a necessary caveat, we will have offered first doses of the vaccine to all 9 priority groups identified by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. These 9 groups include everyone over the age of 50 and all adults with particular underlying health conditions and, of course, all unpaid carers as well. And crucially, these groups account for a significant majority of the country's adult population. And even more crucially, they cover groups of the population that, between them, account for approximately 99% of all COVID-related deaths. So reaching that milestone and also taking account of the fact that it takes a couple of weeks for protection from the vaccine to kick in, it will give us confidence to ease restrictions much more significantly from the 26th of April. So on that date, we expect all parts of Scotland currently in level 4 to move down to a modified level 3. The island communities currently in level 3 will have the option to move at that stage to level 2. However, given what I am about to set out on travel restrictions, we intend to discuss that with these communities over the next couple of weeks. So let me turn firstly to the position on travel. We expect that from 26 April, restrictions on journeys within mainland Scotland will be lifted entirely. However, if restrictions on socialising and hospitality are relaxed more quickly and significantly on the islands, there may be a need to retain some restrictions on travel to and from the mainland to protect island communities from the importation of new cases. However, rather than just impose that decision now on our island communities, we intend to discuss it directly with them to determine what arrangements they consider will work best for their circumstances. We hope that restrictions on journeys between Scotland and other parts of the UK and the wider common travel area can also be lifted, if not on April the 26th, then as soon as possible thereafter. However, we need to keep this under review as part of our efforts to reduce the risk of new cases being imported into Scotland, and we will update the position during April. Reducing the risk of importing new cases and new variants is also directly relevant to the issue of international travel. We intend to discuss with the aviation sector later this week how and when non-essential travel to some international destinations may be possible again. Like the UK Government, we are certain that this will not be achievable before the 17th of May. However, our view is that it may well not be possible for a further period after that, given the circumstances and the situation with the virus in many other parts of Europe and the world. And even when overseas travel does resume, it is likely that a requirement for pre-departure and post-arrival testing will remain in place for some time to come. But we will keep this issue under close review. I want to turn now to the other changes we hope to make from the 26th of April. On that date, we expect all remaining retail premises to reopen. All tourist accommodation will be able to reopen from that date too, subject of course to any wider restrictions that remain in place, for example on hospitality. We expect that libraries, museums and galleries will also reopen from 26 April. Our expectation is that indoor gyms will reopen for individual exercise on that date. Work in people's homes will resume, as well as driving lessons. And we expect that the limit on attendance at weddings, funerals and associated receptions will be raised to 50 from 26 April. From that date, the restrictions on outdoor socialising we expect will be eased further too. From that date, 6 people from up to 3 households will be able to meet outdoors and with no mainland travel restrictions in place, as I said earlier. 12 to 17-year-olds will be able to meet outdoors with up to 6 people from 6 households. Now, unfortunately, given that the risk of transmission we know is greatest inside our own homes, where it's much more difficult to comply with mitigations like physical distancing, we cannot yet say if it will be possible to have people from other households visit us indoors from this date. But given how important this is to all of us, we do intend to keep this under ongoing review. The hospitality sector will also begin to reopen from 26 April. From that date, cafes, restaurants and bars will be able to serve people outdoors in groups of up to 6 from 3 households until 10 p.m. Alcohol will be permitted and there will be no requirement for food to be served. We also hope, though this in particular depends on continued suppression of the virus, that there will be limited indoor opening of hospitality from 26 April too. This will be limited initially to the service of food and non-alcoholic drinks until 8 p.m. and for groups of up to 4 people from no more than 2 households. As was the case last year, venues will need to retain customers' contact details for 3 weeks after their visit. Finally, we will advise that from 26 April, people on the shielding list can return to work, children and young people on the shielding list can return to school or nursery, and students on the shielding list can return to college or university. And the Chief Medical Officer will write this week to everyone on the shielding list to provide more detailed advice. Now, as is obvious, the changes that we hope to make on the 26th of April are significant. We will therefore need to monitor them carefully. For that reason, we do not expect any further changes to be made before the 17th of May, 3 weeks later. However, from that date, we hope that all Level 3 areas, or as many as possible, will move to Level 2. We would hope that from that date, Indoor hospitality could return to greater normality, with alcohol able to be served indoors and within more normal opening hours, though possibly with some continued restrictions, a requirement for booking in 2-hour slots, for example. The precise detail of any continued restrictions will depend on an assessment of the situation closer to the time, but we will be aiming for as much normality as possible. On 17th May, we also hope that adult outdoor contact sports and indoor group exercise can resume. We would also hope that cinemas, amusement arcades and bingo halls will reopen from that date, and that outdoor and indoor events, albeit perhaps on a small scale to begin with, will also restart. We will confirm capacity limits with the events sector over the next few weeks. We also hope that colleges and universities will return to a more blended model of learning from mid-May, meaning that more students can be on campus. Further face-to-face support services will also resume, as will non-professional performance arts. Finally, on 17th May, we expect restrictions on outdoor social gatherings to ease further. And if this has not proved possible before this date, we also expect that people will then be able to meet up inside each other's homes again, initially in groups of probably up to 4 people from no more than 2 households. Now, let me come back to that point, because I know that the restriction on indoor meetings has been one of the hardest parts of lockdown for most of us to bear. Unfortunately, though, it is necessary, and I note that the easing of this restriction is not expected before mid-May in England either. However, all of us yearn to meet with friends and loved ones indoors again, and I know this is especially important for those people who live alone. So we will be keeping this under ongoing review, and we will seek to restore as much normality just as soon as it is safe to do so. Presiding Officer, I also want to give an update today on business support. In the past year, we have provided more than £3 billion of direct support to businesses in Scotland, and for the entirety of the next financial year, we will provide 100% rates relief for retail, hospitality, leisure and aviation businesses. When I spoke in advance of the UK budget, I said that the strategic business framework, which supports closed businesses, would continue until June, even if some businesses were able to open before then. However, a number of businesses have asked us to instead adopt a model of restart grants as we emerge from lockdown. We've decided to follow this advice. So I can confirm that on 22nd March, recipients of support under the Strategic Business Framework Fund will receive a final 4-week payment. There will be no new claims after that date. And then on the 19th of April, recipients will receive a combined final payment comprising a further 2 weeks closure support and a one-off restart grant. For eligible retail businesses, this will mean a payment on the 19th of April of up to £7,500, and for eligible hospitality and leisure businesses, a payment of up to £19,500. And this will provide support that is both more generous and also more flexible than previously envisaged. Presiding Officer, the steps I have outlined today give a significant degree of clarity for the period between now and the middle of May. The unpredictable nature of this virus means, and I hope people can understand this, that it is difficult to give quite as much clarity beyond that point. However, our hope and ambition is that from the early part of June, all of Scotland will move to level 1, which will allow for a further easing of restrictions. And then by the end of June, we hope that all of Scotland will move to at least level 0. Now, level 1 and even more so level 0 will be a massive improvement on where we are right now. But those levels still involve some restrictions, and so we hope that we will be able to get beyond even that. We will be assessing the situation as people would expect on an ongoing basis, with a view to restoring as much normality as possible. It is our fervent hope and also our tentatively increasing expectation that vaccination, continued and effective use of Test and Protect, and probably a continued compliance with some precautions like good hand hygiene, for example, will allow us to keep COVID under much greater control. And that this will then allow us to enjoy many of the things that we took for granted before the pandemic. For example, normal family gatherings where we can hug our loved ones, sporting events, gigs and nightclubs. Now, for me to set out a precise date for all of that right now would involve plucking it out of thin air, and I'd probably be doing it to make my life easier, not yours. So I'm not going to do that. But I do believe that over the coming weeks, as more and more adults are vaccinated, it will be possible to set a firmer date by which many of these normal things will be possible. And I am optimistic that this date will be over the summer. And I know I will not be the only one now looking forward with a real sense of hope to hugging my family over the course of this summer. Presiding Officer, 3 months ago, when we had to reimpose lockdown in the depths of December, it was a dark moment in an unbelievably tough year. I know how difficult the last few months have been, and I will never underestimate and I will never stop being grateful for the sacrifices, the really hard, painful sacrifices that everyone has made. But now, thanks to those sacrifices and the success of the vaccination programme, we are in a much brighter position. As we move further into spring, children and young people will be back in school full-time. Shops and services, we hope, will be reopened. We'll be able to travel more widely. We'll be able to see more of our friends and loved ones and start to meet again in bars, cafes and restaurants. As we move into the summer, an even greater degree of normality, hopefully something much closer to actual normality, with the ability to hug those we love, will become possible. All of that should fill us with optimism. This is certainly the most hopeful I have felt about the situation for a long time. However, as you would expect, I do need to add a note of caution. I know this is the bit none of us want to hear, but the route back to normality does depend on continued suppression. Right now, things are much better, but hundreds of us are still getting this virus every day. Last week alone, more than 200 people were admitted to hospital with the virus. We are getting it under control, but it is still dangerous and it is now even more infectious. So we must continue to suppress it to the lowest level possible as we try to get our lives back to normal. So for now, please continue to stay within the rules. Until April the 2nd, please stay at home, except for specific purposes. Please don't meet people from other households indoors, and please follow the facts advice when you are out and about. By doing all of this over the last long, difficult months, we have protected each other and saved lives. By doing it in the few weeks ahead, we can make steady and sure progress back to normality. And we will continue to protect each other as we journey towards those brighter days that I do firmly believe are now in sight.
Thank you very much. First Minister, we're going to turn now to questions. I encourage all those who haven't already done so to press their buttons, and I call Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's update, as briefed, has started to give some clarity as to when various sectors can reopen. Frankly, it's clarity they were calling for and expecting 3 weeks ago when the First Minister said she would reveal her roadmap out of the restrictions. But that notwithstanding, it will give much encouragement to those who are desperate to get back to work, shops to welcome customers and hairdressers to welcome clients. But a statement can be as instructive by what is not mentioned as much as the information that is. And we know there's a huge job to get public services affected by COVID back online, whether that's NHS testing and treatment, the backlog of court cases, or support services for those with special needs. Presiding Officer, for a week, beginning with International Women's Day and ending on Mothering Sunday, last week was a particularly tough week for women. The disappearance of Sarah Everard and the discovery of her body shocked us all. It led to an outpouring of stories from women across the country of times that they'd been attacked or intimidated, catcalled, flashed at, followed, stalked, abused or threatened. The First Minister recognises this and used her own social media channels to offer support. And of course she can't solve all these problems, but she could offer specific action in specific areas to make things just a little better. The First Minister will have been as struck as I was this week by the number of women explaining how their horizons have narrowed during COVID, that basic pursuits that most men don't think twice about, like going for a walk or run or other outdoor exercise in the evening or after dark, simply isn't an option for them if they want to feel safe and stay safe. So I'm asking her to look again at moving up the reopening date of well-lit and well-supervised safe exercise spaces like gyms, so that people across Scotland, but especially women, can get out of the house and do basic exercise without fear. Another improvement would be to reopen all scans and stages of pregnancy treatment to partners so that women aren't going through so much of the patient pathway alone. And further, the First Minister has previously talked of diagnostic testing restarting, but we know from recent data that urgent referrals for treatment of possible cervical cancer is down around half on rates for 2019. London is trialling at-home smears, so can the First Minister commit to looking at a similar catch-up scheme here? And finally, we've seen a rise in violent crime across Scotland, just at the time that the backlog of court cases has soared. Can we increase the number of High Court sittings and take the court on circuit so that those waiting for justice, particularly those having been subject to violent or sexual crime, can get that justice earlier?
First Minister.
Firstly, had I announced everything I've announced today 3 weeks ago, I would have been doing so without the confidence that we would have reached a stage of having suppressed the virus and vaccinated enough people to make it safe. And what I've tried to do, and some people will agree, some people will disagree, from day one of this pandemic, literally every single day, is take balanced decisions that put the overall safety of the country first. And that is what I am going to continue to do each and every single day. That's more important than headline grabbing or doing things to make the lives of politicians easier, because my job is to protect, as well as I can, the safety of the population at large. And I would repeat again that because of the cautious approach we took coming out of lockdown last year, we kept things open longer than was the case in other parts of the UK. And of course, we're coming out now of our second national lockdown. Other parts of the UK are coming out of their third national lockdown. So these are decisions that are important to get right. Opening up public services that have had to be paused is a priority. And actually, it's because we give that priority, schools being at the top of that list, that we have to be more cautious with opening some parts of our economy, because we can't do everything when headroom to suppress the virus is so limited. So we have unapologetically and unashamedly prioritised the return of schools, and getting the health service back operating normally is a real focus now. The Health Secretary and I had a roundtable discussion just yesterday with representatives from across the health service, hearing directly from them about the priorities and the needs that they have. We've just established a new Centre for Sustainable Development in the National Health Service that is looking at innovative ways, at-home smears, for example, although I think we've got to be careful about exactly how we describe certain things. But all of that is part of what we are now doing to take forward the sustainable recovery of the National Health Service, while also supporting the health service to treat COVID patients for as long as that is necessary. On justice, significant investment in justice, significant work with the Courts and Tribunal Service has meant that, again, creative and innovative ways were found to keep court hearings and trials going, although there has been an undeniable impact on that, and we will continue to bring those services back as safely as possible. With gyms, I hope to see gyms open on the 26th of April for individual exercise, group exercise outdoors, so that people are not faced with having to do that on their own, and that's particularly important for women, particularly in current circumstances. We allowed that from last week to recognise the importance of that for people's physical and mental health. So none of this is easy. It will do nobody any favours for me to stand here and rush to do everything at once, because it will set us back. What we are setting out is a sustainable and steady path out of lockdown, back to normality, and I believe it's one that the vast majority of people across the country will support.
Thank you. Anas Sarwar.
I thank the First Minister for advance sight of her statement, and can I also pass on my condolences to all those that have lost a loved one. Steps to reopen our society and economy are welcome, particularly as they too impact on health and well-being, and I know that this will give much needed hope to people across Scotland, and that's why we need to make sure that this is our last lockdown. In the past week, we have seen a rise in the number of cases, and there are local areas where rates are still much higher than average. Whilst we want to see progress, we need to make sure that as restrictions are lifted, infection rates do not rise with them. Finally, reaching 400,000 vaccinations a week will also be welcome. But last week, almost 420,000 gold standard PCR tests went unused. Will the First Minister commit to using these in our schools and workplaces as restrictions ease? Effective testing and tracing is what will stop us going back into another lockdown. We also welcome the commitment of additional funding for businesses, but the eligibility and the speed of dispersal is crucial. Does the First Minister recognise that it will take time for businesses to recover even after the restrictions are lifted and lockdown ends? And does she agree that transitional support must be made available over the longer term to avoid businesses having to close and people losing their jobs?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, all of us want this to be the last lockdown, but it is not as easy as a politician simply saying that as a soundbite to make it happen. Making sure this is the last lockdown involves taking careful, cautious and sensible decisions, sometimes having to take unpopular decisions in order that we can make sure that our exit from this lockdown, even if it is a bit slower than we are all desperate for it to be, is a steady one and firmly in one direction, and that we don't end up setting ourselves backwards. So that's what I am focused on, and the government is focused on every single day. In terms of testing, we are using lateral flow devices in schools and increasingly in workplaces as well, because they are quicker to get test results. There is, no purpose in using PCR for asymptomatic testing, but it takes longer to get the results. So we are using lateral flow testing, and if those tests are positive, they then get confirmed or otherwise by PCR testing. The reduction in the use of PCR testing is actually because prevalence of the virus is falling, because PCR testing has been prioritised for people with symptoms of COVID, because that's what is really important. But we will continue to use all of our testing capacity, which is much more varied now than it has been before, as effectively as possible. And we're using testing in many more settings than was the case previously. On business support, what I've set out today is equivalent for eligible retail businesses to about 3 months additional support in terms of the start-up grant. I think for eligible hospitality and leisure businesses to about 6 months support. So it will provide additional support even after businesses start to reopen, and is more expansive than what we had previously planned. There will continue to be a need for business support in the medium term. We have always recognised that, which is why we have already made the commitment to 100% rates relief for the worst hit sectors for the entirety of the next financial year. And through the various different mechanisms we have, we will continue to appropriately support business as they get back to trading and back, hopefully, to making profits. And that's, again, to end on this point, that's why it is so important we get these decisions right, so that when businesses start to reopen this time, they stay open and can get back to normal, just like we all want to do.
Thank you. Alison Johnson, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. The fact that we're in a position to start planning reopening things and getting our lives back will be most welcome for everyone. And as always, the Scottish Greens support a cautious approach. But the First Minister flagged an increase in daily cases compared to last week, which is concerning. And there have been reports of an increase in cases linked to the unsafe gatherings of football fans in Glasgow. So I'd like to know if the First Minister thinks this is reflected in these figures. And also, while the rate of positive cases is broadly decreasing across age groups, there is a marked increase in children under 14. So I'd like to understand what measures the Scottish Government is taking to address this trend. And finally, will the Government be introducing lateral flow testing for college, further and higher education students as they begin a very slow return to campus, so that we avoid the surge in infection caused by last year's chaotic reopening of universities? Thank you.
First Minister.
There will be a gradual return of students to further and higher education. We will use lateral flow testing as appropriate and in a targeted way to support that. The increase in students on campus that I've set out today for the early stage, from the early part of April, will be not exclusively but largely focused on further education, because that's where there is a greater need, if students are to complete their courses, to get them with some face-to-face learning on campus. In terms of the case numbers, we have seen an increase in the last week. As the Chief Medical Officer said yesterday, there have been a small number of cases of people that were gathering as part of the football incident last weekend. We may see more of that, given the incubation of the virus. That will not have fully worked its way through yet. But I think we also need to be really open-eyed about this. And after a year, I think we've probably all learned this. This is a virus, so any time we open up and people start to come together, there is greater opportunity for transmission, and we have seen schools return. It's not so much a worry about transmission in schools as about the activity that goes around the return of schools. So while I'm probably one of the last people to be complacent about any increase in cases. If I cast my mind back 2 or 3 weeks, we perhaps worried that the increase in cases we would be seeing after the beginning of the return of schools would be bigger than we're looking at it right now. So we will monitor that very carefully. In terms of younger age groups, the mitigations in schools are really important to try to reduce transmission there as much as possible. This is always going to be a balancing act. Any relaxation of restriction is not neutral. It